Hey everyone, welcome to our small footprint. My name is Nyssa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. I wanted to share with you some experiments that I had done this month. Towards the end of the month, we always get a little bit more time to do things that I don't necessarily have time to do at the beginning of the month, or things that are outside the normal of what I do at the beginning of the month. So, you know, the first half of the month is just spent preserving and getting all the food that we bought in such a way that we can eat it later on, and then later on it's for sort of figuring out how to use it. So I have been working with my French bread style recipe all month because I wanted to be able to make garlic bread to go in the freezer. I know it seems like such a simple thing, but to purchase it, you can get it pretty cheap. That's not really the thing, but it doesn't taste as good. But you can get it pretty cheap, but it's storage factor. So for me, to be able to make a batch of say 10 loaves every week or every second week or whatever and have them in the freezer to use them as sides for whatever meals works really well. So the idea is that a lot of the meals that we're eating these days just aren't quite stretching as far as I would like, and so to be able to throw a stick or two of garlic bread in the oven and serve up with them, I think we'll just take them that little bit further that we're looking for. So I've been working on that for the whole month, and I finally got it consistent enough that I wanted to share it, and I'll share the recipe, and I might do a little like infographic PDF type thing up for this like I did with the flatbread for the Patreon subscribers as well, and I'll put that up too just to make it easier for them there. But I'll share it in the description, and I'll verbalize it here anyway. It's pretty simple, but it just works for us, and it works in the ratios that I needed it to work for cooking the way I need to cook it. So of course some people are going to need to adjust those ratios a little bit as well. The other thing that I did this month was to make the pressed chicken loaf. So I bought one of the pressed meat steamers. It was months ago, and I haven't used it yet because I just hadn't got around to it. And I got some chicken trim through the hamper, which is just little scraps and offcuts of chicken. And so I decided that I was going to mince that up and give that a go in the pressed meat cooker to make chicken loaf, because the kids love chicken loaf. I don't buy it very often. It's sort of $10–12 a kilo, and it's you know, processed meat, and I don't like it much, so it's not something that I buy. But occasionally, like if Darryl's going to buy a loaf of bread in town or something and we don't have cold meat, he might grab a kilo of the chicken loaf for the kids to have with that and things like that. But I thought if I could make it, that would be really neat. There's some cost considerations I'll go through it at the end as to whether it's really worthwhile, but have a look at the process anyway. It may not be worthwhile at all for some people, and it might be for others. It just really depends if you have limitations on what you can and can't eat too. So I'm going to share those two main things in this video, so enjoy watching and I will see you at the end. Now, the batch of French bread dough that I make makes 7 sticks. You could alter that though. It makes 7 sticks at around about 250 grams each. You could of course make the sticks less weight and get more out of it, but for me, cooking on the barbecue, which will change soon, but for me, cooking on the barbecue, 7 was the maximum amount of sticks that I could fit in my baguette trays on the barbecue. So that is what I'm working on. But I actually did 2 batches so that I could have 14 sticks all up, because I wanted to do a bigger batch so that I could have some for the freezer. Now, I mixed it up in the 2 batches in the KitchenAid because the KitchenAid can't tolerate more than one set of this dough at a time. KitchenAid doesn't do much over sort of 1.1 kilos of flour is about the maximum that I've found, the limit of my KitchenAid. So for the size serving that I'm doing, we are doing 600 grams of water with 20 grams of yeast, up to 50 grams of yeast depending on how quickly you want to make these, and lower if you've got plenty of time for it to proof. The more yeast you use, the quicker it will rise and the less tolerant the dough will be of being handled. It gets slacker because the quicker it rises, especially if you've got heat going as well. So if it's warm, you want to lower yeast. But 20 grams works quite well in this for me at the moment. About 50 grams of sugar. Again, you can reduce that, but we're looking for a slightly sweet, dense, soft crumb, and that sugar helps with that, and it helps with the browning on the top as well. 20 grams of salt. Again, you can adjust that. Salt does impact the taste of the bread though. I do not like doughs without salt in them, but if you're okay with it, then you're okay with it. 100 grams of oil, and this is sort of something that I I didn't want to use an egg-based dough, I didn't want to use a milk-based dough, but having that oil in there is enough to keep this really soft, and it keeps it nice and fresh for a couple of days. And then 1 kilo of flour. So that was the whole point, was to get these nice even amounts to make this dough up. And I split this all up. It's about 1800 grams, and I split it all up into 7-ish sticks. Now, because I mixed up the 2 batches, I stuck it in this big Cambro container that I have that Susan sent me. I am super grateful for this container. I have looked at Cambro containers for a long time, but they are quite expensive. But they are just perfect because they're straight-sided for proofing dough in, and this fits the 2 kilos worth of dough in it quite easily. So I mixed up the first batch, scraped it all out and oiled the Cambro container slightly, put it in there, and then I just got started on the second batch. I did use warm water for these as well because it is cold at my place at the moment, and we want to get through this fairly quickly. We want this to be a fairly quick process, and so that I can so that I can push the 2 batches of dough shaped and through the oven in a fairly quick sort of a time. So we used warm water, not too hot or you will kill your yeast. So if the water is too warm, you need to use part warm, part cold. But I just tend to put the kettle on the burner for like 30 seconds, just enough to take the temperature just a bit up to about, you know, the skin temp sort of thing. I start out by measuring out some portions. So it's 225 to 250 per portion. It really, I have found it varies a little bit, and I don't really know why, because the dough should weigh the same. It should be 1800 grams no matter what, but obviously it's possible that my scales are a little uneven too, because the stainless steel bench has some dips in it. So I'm guessing sometimes my weights are a little bit off. I am going to try and find myself a nice board that fits exactly underneath the feet of my scales that isn't used for anything but that, but I haven't got it at the moment. But anyway, so you are looking at 225 to 250 grams per portion. You can weigh the whole dough if you want, and then, well, I would suggest weighing it anyway and then dividing it by however many you want to make, because as I said, I make 7, but they're a significant size, and some people might want to make smaller ones or make them into, like, you know, sub rolls or hoagie rolls or something like that. I weigh it out approximately and then shape it into a ball to rest for a bit and loosen up while I weigh the rest of them. I bake 7 at a time in the barbecue, so I wanted 7 balls done up initially so that I had a bit of a process down, and start the other 7 afterwards, because we're going to need them to proof consecutively so that they're not overproofing before they go into the oven. So once I had 7, I sprinkled my baguette pan with some semolina. Now this is a silicon based one because it allowed me to purchase 2 and cut one in half, because I can use a full one on a large pan and then I can use 2 of them on the smaller pan, and that's all I can fit into the barbecue. I actually have ordered some anodized metal ones to use in the new oven because I would prefer that to the silicon if it works, but we will see. I ordered them off Temu because they were the cheapest there, and I'm not sure how well they're going to work, so I didn't want to spend a fortune on them. But the silicon ones work really well and they're easy to store, and it meant that I could cut them to fit the trays that I want to use. So I recommend them. I got these ones off Amazon, I think, so definitely recommend them, but I also wanted to try the anodized ones. I also put a rack on so I'm using a cookie sheet, just an aluminium cookie sheet, and I put a rack on the cookie sheet, and then I put the baguette pans on top of that, because being an aluminium cookie sheet in a barbecue with the bottom flame heat, they burn the bottom before they get cooked through on the top, so I put it on a rack as well. I grabbed the ball that I formed first, so it's the one that's had the most rest time, and then I flip it onto some semolina. Then stretch the dough out into a rectangle gently. So if it's starting to tear, you need to let the dough rest a little bit longer, but this dough is very forgiving, very quick with that 20 grams of yeast in there, and a very soft and silky dough because of that oil. So you just want to stretch it out into a rectangle, trying to make sure that that dough still has a nice clean skin on it without sort of tearing any. Once it's in a rectangle, I roll it up, trying to keep the sausage shape fairly even, pinch each end closed a bit and place it in the pan. Now, I'm still no expert at this, but I'm getting pretty consistent results just by shaping it this way. It's not at all how I would shape sourdough. The texture of a sourdough dough is very different to this very silky yeasted dough in my experience, but this seems to be working okay. I still sometimes get a few blowouts if I'm not careful to try and pinch that, so you really, as you roll it, you really want to pinch each roll in to make sure there's no great big air bubbles stuck anywhere, because otherwise you're going to end up with blowouts on the sides of the dough. So I just go through with each of the 7 balls and stretch and roll in place of the baguette pan. You definitely need to stretch them further than expected and make them thinner than you think, because they expand really well into the shape. Again, being a yeasted dough, again with sourdough tends to, especially baguette type style dough, tends to not change too much of an extreme in anything but height when you cook it, whereas this yeasted dough will go out and up, which is why the baguette trays are fantastic for it. So you want to start with it a thinner sausage than you expect it to be. Once I had 5 on the larger tray, I put that back into the proofer and shaped the 2 for the smaller tray. So same process, semolina in the molds, flipping them, stretching them into that rectangle and rolling them, putting them aside to proof before baking. So I've tried to be as concise here as possible with this, but it is a yeasted dough, and yeasted doughs are pretty forgiving, which is part of the appeal of using yeasted doughs too. Like if you drop a lot of the bubbles and that out of them when you're handling them, they regain it at least a couple of times. Whereas sourdough, if you knock all the air out of it when you're shaping it, sometimes that's it, it becomes a fail. So the ability to overhandle yeasted dough is nice in this sense when you're figuring out the shaping and what works and how big you want it and all that sort of thing. But it is going to be a dense crumb on it. It's going to be a solid crumb, no holes or anything like that, because that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something to use as garlic bread, so we want it to be that dense sort of a end product. The other half of the dough I split into balls like before and let loosen up and then shape the same way. Now, I only have enough of these baguette molds for 1 bake at the moment. As I said, I bought some more, and I bought some of the anodized metal one, and I might use both of them initially so that I've got enough to have a whole bunch proofing. I don't know how much I'm going to be able to cook in this new oven yet. I looked at the measurements of the oven, internal measurements of the oven and my baking trays, and I'm not sure because it looks like it might only be 740 internally, even though I thought it was a 900mm oven, but I'm not going to know until I get home. So for the moment, I ordered both of them, but for this particular, right now, and on this video, I only have enough of those baguette molds for 1 bake. So I can't proof the second batch in the molds while I'm baking the first batch. So what I did was I used one of my flour sack tea towels. It's sort of a cloche, sort of a baking cloth. I sprinkled it with some semolina and I placed each loaf on the towel, using the towel to separate. Though I probably should have used 2, because I did end up with them sticking a little bit. I didn't have enough fabric between them. And I don't have a transfer paddle either for transferring the baguettes once they are proofed on there. So there is going to be a bit of a risk of deflation when I transfer it from the cloche to the pan, but we're using what we have. And this seemed to be the method that was going to have the least problems compared to like proofing it on a tray or whatever else. It would have just pushed into itself. Having that fabric to help hold its shape was all I could think of at the time. While they were proofing and baking in turn, I got started on trying out my deli meat steamer. So now I bought this months ago, but hadn't had a chance to give it a go. As I said, I got a couple of bags of that chicken trim from the hamper, so I decided to use that to make the chicken loaf. The meat steamer, you can see it in the bottom right corner, is a cylinder of stainless steel with a flat plate that you screw a spring onto, and you push the contents of the cylinder down as much as you can, and then you steam the whole unit. So it's called formed meat or pressed meat or formed ham, and that's how they refer to it. I was unsure how much meat would fit in the one that I bought. I'll link the model I bought in the description, but there is a lot of them. It seems to have hit a popularity peak since I bought this one, because there seem to be an awful lot more options than when I bought it. But anyway, so I started out with 500 grams of meat. I added a drizzle of oil. I used Vegeta as my seasoning just to keep things nice and simple, and added a drizzle of maple as well, just to give it that processed meat sweetness that always seems to have. And then I blended it with the Thermomix for about 1.5 minutes until it had this texture, sort of a pink paste of sorts with that stringiness is what you're after for the ability to get it to mold and hold. This reminds me of, there was that documentary a while ago, I think it was a Jamie Oliver documentary, where they did the pink paste to make chicken nuggets, was it? And people were really turned off. Any meat that you spin like this is going to look like a pink paste. Okay, yes, the McDonald's ones potentially have some additives in them as well, but any meat that you emulsify to this point is just going to look gross. And that's just the way it is, because the fibers of the meat end up this stringy sort of a texture that allows the meat to hold itself together and still have the texture of a meat even though it's been processed. Like if you don't process this enough, it won't hold together and the texture will be sort of crumbly, but you process it to this pink slime and it ends up being toothsome and like texture of meat. And anyway, just for anyone looking at this and thinking how gross it is, it does look gross, but it's tasty. I have made something similar to this before using the Varoma on the Thermomix. It's a Skinny Mixes recipe. She does something similar with chicken and then she uses cling wrap and steams it in the Thermomix, but that isn't feasible for me with the power usage, the quantity of time to run the Thermomix as a steamer, and just making a small quantity at a time isn't really, I'm looking to make more. And realistically, if this works well, then that I could purchase more of these steamers and have like 3 of them sitting in the one pot of water, which I think I mentioned later on too. Then I spooned it into the cylinder. So I was making sure to press it in there nice and firm, trying to get any air bubbles out so that it's all sort of one homogeneous mass. I used a little oil on my knuckles to help me to press it in without it sticking, and I used the spoon or a knife to make holes and then sort of push any air out to try and work that as well. I think a metal skewer would work really well, to sit here and run a metal skewer, stab it in there a few times and then keep on pressing it just to make sure you're trying to get all those air pockets out, but I couldn't find one of my metal skewers. They're one of those things that I buy to use for kebabs or as cake testers, and you can never find them more than the first time I open them. But anyway, once I had all the chicken in there, it was a little under half filled, so I decided to do another 500 gram batch and make sure it was nice and full to make the most of the process and the time and that sort of thing. I did the exact same thing, 500 grams of the trim in the Thermomix with a drizzle of both oil and maple and a dessert spoon of the Vegeta. Pureed it for about 90 seconds and then pressed it into the cylinder in the same method. Once it was all in there, I smoothed out the top and placed the plate on top with the spring attached. I then used the lid to lock the spring down and then locked the lugs under the lid as well, so that the spring is under pressure, therefore the meat is under pressure the whole time, keeping it nice and compacted. Now, my kit did come with a manual thermometer that fit in the hole in top. However, I got the box down and the thermometer was missing. I don't recall if I used it for something else or what, but regardless, it was missing. So I used my Bluetooth system instead, which probably was slightly easier regardless. The probe went down about the halfway mark, so I was comfortable with that. And I just attached the reader to the metal shelf behind the stove because it's got a magnetic back on it. It also means I could check in on the temperature from my phone at any point. Not that I strayed too far. With the first time I'm doing something new, I tend to try and stay sort of close. I placed it in a pot with water. Excuse the pot. This is the one that Sonnet burns popcorn in all the time. I topped the water up so that it was as high as I felt comfortable with it. We don't want it to spit and hiss everywhere as it was boiled, but I also wasn't sure about the weight of the steaming unit either. I don't want it to topple because we don't want it underwater. We want the water up the sides, but we don't want the actual unit to be submerged because there's a hole in the top. I put the lid on it just to bring it to a boil a bit quicker, and then removed it once it was steadily boiling, and we'll come back to check on it. The first lot of French loaves had finished their second proof, so I scored them and put them in the barbecue. Now, this bread doesn't spread a whole lot on the scoring, but I have found that if I haven't scored them, they are more likely to blow out the bottom seam if I haven't pinched it quite well enough. So having the scoring helps with that, and keeping the consistency of the size of the sticks. It also looks nice once it's cooked, but I'm not being pedantic. I'm just using a razor and just putting lines in the top to give it a little bit of a stress point that it can go out if it needs to, but more just to give it that look as well. Once the water was boiling, I started a timer, just out of curiosity as to how long it would take to get to temp, and just to assess the time that it requires to make this and how, and you know, all that kind of thing. After about 28 minutes, the internal temp was about 23 degrees, and I topped up the pot just a little bit to keep the water level high. I'm theorizing that the more it's submerged, the quicker it will cook, because it'll be more evenly heated through. I don't know how accurate that is, but that's my theory based on, you know, cooking experience. So I decided to top up the water now that I was comfortable that the whole thing wasn't going to tip over and things like that, because that was more my worry before, which is why I kept the water level just that little bit lower. This is what the first loaf of French bread looks like, a nice even colour. As I said, the slits didn't expand as much, but we also didn't have much in the way of blowout either in the bottoms. They're all fairly consistently sized and shaped, even with minimal shaping effort. Now, I haven't used any steam or lids on any of these because we're going for a softer bread. So if I was going to use these as a soup bread or something, I would probably have put a lid over them or some steam or something so that we got a nice crusty top on them. These are very soft. It's on purpose because we're going to turn them into garlic bread and then they're going to be baked again later on. So we want that sort of really soft sort of effect to it. I got the next lot into the pan, and as I said, I didn't have a peel to use to transfer these from the close to the tray, so I did deflate them a little as I went, but it still worked, and it's yeasted dough, so there's not as much of a concern about it as if it was sourdough. Once I transferred them, I scored them the same way as the last lot and got them in the barbecue. At about 1 hour and 15, the internal temp on the chicken loaf was 77. My goal temp here was 76 or 165 Fahrenheit, which is what you need chicken to be at to be a safe temperature. So we're safe at this point. I turned the pan off. I did leave the cylinder in the water while it was cooling off, and the temperature did climb a few more degrees before it started dropping again, which I was kind of happy about, just in case that probe isn't quite hitting the very center of the mold. I was a little impatient and after only about 15 minutes I decided to crack it open. There was a lot of oil and juice in the top of the chicken, which isn't a bad thing. It's going to keep that chicken moist as it's cooked. And there were some bits that came away with the plate holding it down, which I taste tested, and they tasted just like chicken, so that was a good start. It was probably only another 15 minutes later and I decided I couldn't wait till the next day to try getting it out. And I wanted to check it out. So I poured off some of that oil and then tipped the loaf onto a board. It came out fairly easily. There was one piece that sort of sheared off that obviously the join just wasn't great on it. I definitely think that I would have been better off not getting it out until the next day and letting it sort of, you know, set a bit in that mold, but I was being impatient. And I was aware of that. I sliced some off to taste, and it tastes like chicken. It has a slightly more meaty texture than the loaf. Definitely more, it more resembles meat than the chicken loaf that you buy. The chicken loaf that you buy, which is what I don't like about it, is very smooth. It doesn't have much in the way of a grainy texture or anything else. It's just a smooth processed meatloaf. And it's fine, but it's really just not to my taste, whereas this tastes like sliced chicken. I decided that I got it out too early and I put it all back in the press, put it back together and put it in the fridge for the night, as I probably should have in the first place. I probably should have poured that juice back in there too to sit overnight. I wonder if it would have absorbed some of that back up, but I didn't, and we will make this again and we will test that theory. I have made a bunch of lunches out of it over the next couple of days, and I have a What We Eat in a Week is coming out. I think it's the next video to this one, so you'll see it in sliced up and used in various different ways in that What We Eat in a Week. Now, the last step in making my French breadsticks into garlic bread is the garlic butter. I'm lucky at the moment to have fresh garlic to roast and use. I bought some in bulk from a local farmer, but once I've run out this season, I will use jarred garlic and probably add a touch of maple or something to knock that acidity back and get similar results. So I peeled all the garlic I had roasted the day before into a bowl. I added Nuttalex because it's what I have at the moment. You could use any fat you wanted, and I did contemplate whisking some olive oil into it and setting it up, but I had Nuttalex available, so that's what I used. I like to add a little glug of my homemade Worcestershire sauce as well, and a good heavy pinch of salt. That's just the flavor profile I choose. Some fresh parsley would be really nice. Whatever you want. It's just a roasted garlic butter, whatever flavor you like in that. When I make my bacon seasoning up again, putting that in there would be really nice. Anyway, I used my immersion blender to create an emulsion to get that butter really fluffy and the garlic spread all the way through. My Thermomix works really well for this too, but I think all my bowls were dirty, which happens a lot. I got myself an extra bowl, so I have 3 bowls now, and it just means that I have 3 dirty bowls instead of 2 most of the time. I sliced the sticks, leaving the crust on the bottom whole. If you have problems with not going all the way through the bread, you can put a chopstick or even a knife or a fork on either side of the bread, and that way that'll stop you being able to take your knife all the way to the board, and it will give you that sort of even distance between the bread and the base. But if you go through, it's really not that big a deal. Then I gently split the dough apart enough to get a knife full of the garlic butter into every gap. As I said, if you accidentally break your bread off, it's not that big a deal because we're going to be wrapping it in foil. I find if you don't wrap in foil for that initial cook of the garlic bread, it overcooks on the outside, but the garlic butter coated bread in the middle isn't heated through enough, especially if it's cooking from frozen. So we're generously, but not overly so, because we don't want things to end up soggy, slathering the garlic butter in each slice, and then getting a piece of foil just a bit longer than the stick, placing it in the middle, bringing the two edge pieces together up above the stick and folding it like you were wrapping a present, then tucking the ends up as well to catch any of that garlic butter that heats up and spills out in the foil to soak the bottom crust, and repeat. I've been making these fairly regularly to get in the freezer so that when I cook a meal up that looks like it just might not be enough, I can throw one or two of these in the barbecue as well and offer them as a side. But we really like them with lunch too sometimes if I'm just doing leftovers or something and just want a little extra, then I can throw a couple of these in the oven and we've got a better sized meal for that day. Now, in regards to the costings of the chicken loaf, so the trim that I got was, I can't remember what Darryl paid for it. $5 a bag or something, and it was 2 kilos or 2.5 kilos per bag, so it was really cheap. And you can't get trim very often. Like, I did Google to see if I could find anywhere that sold chicken trim, like a Leonard's or a Steggles or something, and the only place that I found that sold chicken trim sold it for $9 a kilo, which is the same price as chicken breast, so that's not going to happen. So making chicken loaf, I wouldn't buy chicken to make chicken loaf. Because for a start, most chicken is more expensive than chicken loaf, but also I can eat that chicken without all that effort. Like I can eat chicken on sandwiches by cooking it and shredding it, or smoking it and slicing it, or whatever. So I don't need to do that kind of work with chicken to be able to use it as a sandwich meat or a cold meat. And so I wouldn't. But things like the chicken trim, or if I got chicken mince really cheap, then I would, because I wouldn't use that for that purpose, if that makes sense. So it took, 90 minutes of gas, and as I said, with the pot I could fit probably three, maybe 4 of those steamers in there, and that would be worthwhile of that 90-minute gas, because I could always slice it and freeze it as well. But each of those steamers are $40, $50, though I did notice there was some that were cheaper these days, but still. So that's quite an outlay initially, and then only if I've got the meat to use. So you can make formed hams and things like that with it though, and I was discussing it with Mum and saying that maybe the pork mix that I use to make my sausages might be really nice as a cold meat too. So I will probably give it a go with pork, because the pork that I buy is $6.99 a kilo, but I have to do something with it to eat it anyway. Like we can eat it as a roast, and we do, but I try not to eat it only as a roast because we go through it too quickly. Whereas if I was using if I used a kilo to make a ham, then that ham-ish, it's not really ham, but you know what I mean, will last us 2 or 3 lunches, and that's a good use of that kind of time and process and that sort of thing. I really enjoyed it. I think the chicken meat was great. It was really nice to have that cold meat that we had made, but I'm not sure how relevant it will be as a constant use thing. I am going to try it with the pork because that would be interesting, but at the same time, I use pork mince a lot of things, and maybe that pork mince would be better off in the sausages, which we've just finished the last from the big batch that we did recently. So I don't know. It was really neat. I'm glad I tried it, and if I get trim like that again, then that's a great use for it. But again, I still use that trim for various other things. Like I used it to make chicken Kievs and chicken mince for stir fries, and so I'm not sure. Let me know what you think about it. I understand that it's a whole lot better for me and the children than buying chicken loaf, but I don't buy chicken loaf. That's the thing too. Like if I bought a couple of kilos of chicken loaf every month and so instead I could make my own, hey, that's an easy win. But I don't buy chicken loaf because it's kind of gross. It's not. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with Chicken Loaf. The kids adore it. Darryl likes it. I buy it for them on occasion, but it's an expensive product, which is not the greatest product. I'm not yucking anyone's yum. If you like Chicken Loaf, it's perfectly okay. But yeah, so I'm not sure how much use it will get, but it was really neat to be able to use it. And I would hope to use it at least a few more times because I paid the money for it. And guinea fowl are saying goodnight. And I definitely will try it with the pork and see how it go. I don't know that I like the idea of beef in it, which it would be a good use of beef because we buy that beef trim and we mince a lot of it, but I'm not sure that I like the idea of, like, I like cold roast beef, but I'm not sure about formed beef, but maybe I need to give it a go. Though, is Spam beef or is Spam pork? Don't know. So, and I don't like Spam. But it's making it myself and my own flavors and knowing what's in it might make my preferences on it different too. So anyway, I wanted to share and I will see you on the next video, which should be on what we eat in a week, and I'm having to yell over these guinea fowl, so I'm gonna go. Thank you for watching, guys, and I will see you on the next video.